separate rainforests and how we can get them back, come on Friday. But for today, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Lena Chan, who's been instrumental in a big part of what you're going to hear today about this conversion of Singapore into this city in nature, where people have so much access to nature, and to really sort of rethinking what urban nature is about in terms of itself being a biodiversity hotspot, and also providing all of these benefits to people who live in cities. So focusing nature away from remote pristine areas to the landscapes and cityscapes that people live in. And so she's the Senior Director of the International Biodiversity Conservation Division of the National Parks Board of Singapore. And as well as the work, just to describe it, that includes updating the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity, drafting of the National Park Service Nature Conservation Master Plan, and supervising the Palau Tekong Coastal Protection and Management Enhancement Project. And so her current duties include being the national focal point for the Convention of Biological Diversity in Singapore, a governing board member of the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity, various other things that I won't go through all of them, and a member of the Biophilic Cities Network Advisory Board. And she's published a lot of scientific papers on ecology, parasitology, and women and the environment, and chapters on books in conservation biology. And she co-edited some supplements of the Gardens Bulletins of Singapore that were dedicated to a biodiversity survey of the Central Nature Reserve and a comprehensive biodiversity survey of the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve in 2019. So a whole range of very practical ecological experience, but I think also an interesting experience on how a city can convert towards being a city in nature. So we look forward to hearing your talk. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And let me just slides up. And online, if somebody could just message that you can hear okay, just to make sure everything is good. Maybe somebody could just unmute or just say in the chat. Oh, good. All's good.
Everything is good.
Great. So I need to just share the screen first so they can see. So that is okay. Great. Let's make all the chats. Thanks for a responsive online audience. That's always good. Let's close this. Great. Off you go.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Yavinda, for inviting me. I think that's it's a pleasure to come and share my experiences with you. I think I should be in the picture, right? Doesn't matter whether I'm not sure, but never mind. I think I'll just carry on. Yeah.
Maybe around here or something. That's good.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to share with you cities in nature, and basically my experiences with Singapore. So I'm going to share in more details transforming Singapore into a city in nature. Just get this. Why are we talking about cities in nature? That's because more than half, in 2008, there was the first time that we recorded that more than 50% of the world actually live in cities. But now you can see this growing number that by 2022, already 55% of the world's population live in urban areas, increasing to 68% by 2050. And many, I'm sure you can also concur with it, that personal experience shows that biodiversity is important for our physical, mental well-being. Therefore, it is extremely crucial that biodiversity, we should be in connection with biodiversity all the time. And therefore, cities where most people live must be biodiverse for our own well-being. Yeah. And quite often I remember people saying that, is there biodiversity in cities? And contrary to common wisdom, actually, there is actually a lot of biodiversity in cities. Therefore, we must reimagine cities as nexus of biodiversity. While we should actually continue conserving biodiversity in pristine areas, there is so much richness of biodiversity in cities that we must see how we can actually ensure that there are habitats and methods to actually conserve biodiversity in cities. And people talk a lot about conserving nature reserves. I think the important thing is to actually encourage this other effective nature-based conservation measures. And that's actually, for me, I feel very strongly about, because if you just conserve it in pristine areas, then you have to actually go somewhere else actually to actually enjoy the benefits of biodiversity. So these are some of the cities that have partaken in applying the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity, which I'll talk about later. And it's an index to help evaluate and also to evaluate and monitor biodiversity in cities. And so the cities include, do I have a pointer or should I? Okay, anyway, the first one is Singapore, and then we have Edmonton, that's in Victoria Gasteiz, and that's in Waikateri, Toledo, Edinburgh. So there's diversity of cities. We're not talking about just about Singapore, but cities in different continents that have applied the Singapore Index. So now I'm going to concentrate on the Singapore story. So before 1819, Singapore was actually covered with great diversity. Pristine forests, secondary forests, freshwater swamps, mangroves, rivers, grassland, the whole works. And we have actually, the Singapore Botanic Gardens is a very good archive of pictures and books that shows the different ecosystems that we could find in Singapore before 1819. So this gives you very quickly how we started off having primary vegetation, and by 1930, by 1900, 1920, 1930, we've lost most of our primary forests. And I think we've got to blame the British, because they were there cutting down, trying to convert everything into plantations and agriculture, because they came to Singapore hoping that it would be an economic base. So then when Singapore pulled out in 1965, when Singapore left Malaysia and then had to survive on its own, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, then had to come up with a plan. How can Singapore survive? And so he pulled people out of the rural areas and housed them in tall buildings. So for those of you who have visited Singapore would know that we have many, many high-rise buildings. They were all housed there. And therefore, you find that many of the areas that people used to inhabit were actually left. And these then, being in the tropics where it's hot and wet, was wonderful. You can put any stick on the ground and it will grow. And therefore, as long as you have a good gene pool of plants, and therefore you find that many of these areas actually reverted back to secondary vegetation. Now, the area of Singapore is 733 kilometers. And that actually, if we quickly do some calculation, The UK is 332 times larger than Singapore, but its population is only 12.6 times. So you can imagine the density of Singapore's population density. So it's very high. We're talking of a highly densely populated island city-state. Now, we've got a small island, limited land, having to survive, which means that we've got to have land use that will cover things like defense, water, food, housing, transport, infrastructure, the whole works. How do we manage? How do we mitigate the impacts of climate change and build resilience? Do I then keep working for that slide? What do we do? Okay, hold on. Let me just. Okay. Yeah. So we've got all these challenges. We still have lots of terrestrial ecosystems, tropical rainforests. The canopy cover is still quite good for some areas like Bukit Timah Nature Reserve and Central Catchment. We have freshwater streams, not very many, but nonetheless some. This is in terms of terrestrial biodiversity. Big, tall dipterocarps, hornbills, otters, coastal and marine ecosystems. For Singapore, we're one of the world's largest ports in the world, and yet how do these coastal and marine ecosystems survive? With mangroves, mudflats, rocky shores, coral reefs, sea grass beds, migratory birds. We are one of the key landing points for migratory birds for the Australia-Asia pathway. So we've got to think about that too. Hard corals, marine organisms. And very important, we have to recognize that there are urban ecosystems. Diversity of it, but we're beginning actually to define what we mean by urban ecosystems and how do we actually ensure the quality as well as the beneficial uses of urban ecosystems, the free ecosystems that we can benefit from them. This is what you can find actually in a city. Up in a high-rise flat, you can actually see the olive-back, sunbird, woodpeckers. We quite often see hornbills too. Now, I'm always show this slide because it's an evolving numbers in this slide. Just to give you some idea, probably a few years ago, the number of bird species would have been maybe 398, and now it's 470. How does this number increase? We've got a panel of bird ornithologists, experts, who then track these birds. And what often we define as this number of species recorded in Singapore would be that these birds must actually then start breeding before, and they would have stayed in Singapore, resided in Singapore for a number of years before we record them as number of species. So there are clear definitions on it. So 407 bird species, there are about 10,000 bird species in the world. So Singapore actually houses about 4% of the world's bird species. When it comes to hard corals, there are about 800, according to ICRI, which is the International Coral Reef Initiative. They figured there are about 800 hard coral species. Singapore manages to actually harbor 255. That's about 30%. And we have to share it with a whole host of other users, like port, other industries. how do we manage that? It's a challenge. I'm not going to say it's easy, but it actually involves quite important integrated planning and integrated use. So I'm going to start off by saying that Singapore has always been known as a garden city. So we started off as a garden city in 1965. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was adamant. He did his studies in University of Cambridge. So he really liked the gardens that were set in the UK. So when he went back, he said, we must have gardens. And being a very, very disciplined person, his idea of a garden city was very much that.
Okay. I'm just trying to say you can read the slides. Carry on, Lena.
Okay, so it's a very organized city garden, and he ensured that there were gardens in parks scattered around Singapore with different kinds of types of gardens. You would have the bougainvillea, and then you would have the seashore, the East Coast Park. So there are a diversity of parks. And then after 50 years, we decided that we couldn't sit still. We are more than a garden city. So we became a city in a garden. This is just a play of words, not quite words. A city in garden is one where you open the door and you would then see that you're actually in a garden with lots of greenery. So instead of gardens all around, you're actually you step into a garden the minute you actually leave your house. And we did that by actually intensifying tree planting and connecting parks and greenery with the park connectors network, and ensure that there's integrated greenery within the built environment. Doesn't seem to want to. Hello? Okay. So, but we realized that that wasn't quite enough. We needed a closer affinity with nature, not so manicured, sustainable. Because when you have a very manicured city, it is high intensive management. So we felt that we wanted closer affinity with nature that will grow organically. So we then stepped up and said, we want to transform ourselves into a city in a garden, city in nature, which is a proper, unique, a change in paradigm set, and where you integrate ecology into your urban landscape. And we create sustainable ecosystems for both nature and people to thrive, not one above the other, but both together. Based on that, we need to provide immersive experiences, because you can't convince people and say, but we want to ensure that people have that experience, and then they themselves say, that's what we want. And that is why we need to provide immersive experiences with nature for our improved health and well-being. And more importantly, people have to be responsible for it. So to build up this community of stewards, I think that's the important thing, because people become part of that journey rather than it's a government-led initiative. Okay, so now we had this Singapore Green Plan, and we feel that it's a multi-ministerial and multidisciplinary initiative, which is why the Singapore Green Plan involves 5 ministries: Ministry of Education, Ministry of National Development, Ministry of Trade and Industry, Ministry of Transport, and Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment. So which means that we incorporate urban planning, we include development, infrastructure development, education, all have to be, it has got to be a cohesive and comprehensive effort by the Singapore government. And we recognize that it's not just the government, but also green citizenry. So that's actually very important. And one of the key plans is actually the concept of this city in nature. And I'm just highlighting three main targets, and that is the three main targets that I'm highlighting are, we want to plant 1 million more trees and have every household, that means 100% of Singapore's residents should be within a 10-minute walk or 400 meters from a park or nature area by 2030. So which means that we're not talking, when we talk about 10-minute walk, we're not talking about just closeness, but we're talking about accessibility, because you could have something that defines it as, oh, you know, it's about 400 meters, but the 400 meters could be across a highway, and then it makes it, it's very difficult to reach. So that is why we define it as a 10-minute walk. And originally we set that target because we were totally aware of an aging population who will not be able to actually walk that far, which was why we had this 10-minute walk. But with COVID-19, it proved to be a godsend, because we found that everybody wanted access to greenery. And if you don't have a large garden, which, like, you know, many Singaporeans don't have gardens, then accessibility to parks is actually very important. Yeah. And we are adding over 130 hectares. It seems very small to people here, but it means a lot to Singapore, the 130 hectares, and enhancing all the existing parks with more, you know, with restoration enhancement. And by 2035, the planners have to then try and find more than 1,000 hectares of. So these are all the challenges that, you know, not just everybody has to face, because some other land user would have to then sacrifice or, you know, work around that. Not working this very well, am I? Is it better for me to? Sorry?
Maybe I sit there, I can just sort of click on
click. I think that might be easier. Is it just clicking or is it?
There you go.
Okay, yeah. So here we have this new paradigm, and that's restoring nature back into the city for people, for livability, sustainability, and well-being. And by applying nature-based solutions, we hope to achieve climate resilience. Resilience, that's quite important, not just mitigation or adaptation, but resilience, ecological resilience, and social resilience. I think we need a comprehensive, targets here. Thanks. So how do we go about doing it? So it's not just empty words or just principles. So our key strategies are, first, we need to conserve and extend our natural capital, because this natural capital will form the gene pool. Second, we have to intensify nature in our gardens and parks, in the existing areas that we have that's green. And more importantly, which is your other effective conservation-based measures, which would be to restore nature into urban landscape. How do we actually, because % of our time in buildings, how do we ensure that we have actually access or connection with actually nature in buildings, in the very urban landscape? And importantly too, is to strengthen connectivity between all this greenery so that we would actually increase the effective area that flora and fauna can actually use. So strengthen connectivity between our green spaces. And the key enablers are everyone must play a role. Like I've always mentioned that, are you a lecturer in the university, but you're also a human being? You are also a user of biodiversity. So you can't say that, oh, I'm actually an industrial person, I am, a banker. In the daytime, I act as a banker, but when I go home, I've got to feed my family, so we all have an important role to play in biodiversity conservation. And the other important point is there's so much emphasis on climate change that people forget that many of the climate change solutions are not necessarily good for biodiversity conservation. But most biodiversity conservation initiatives and solutions will most likely be good for climate change. So they're intimately interlinked, and therefore we must approach these two issues together and not separately. And so I'm glad that COP27 placed much more emphasis now on biodiversity. And with the COP15 that's coming up, we hope to actually see how we can actually work together and look for solutions, joint solutions. Yeah. Next, please. So very quickly, in the Singapore context, we need to conserve and extend our natural capital. How do we do it? Next, please. So these are actually the kind of forests that we see in Singapore. The canopy is actually quite close, and we try and conserve what we have as much as possible. And these are the 4 key areas that have good biodiversity. And next, please. These are the core. And what we do is we link them up using methods like the path of least resistance, analyzing how do we actually using GIS, studying the connectivity, and then see how we can make use of roads, parks, and then join up all these various areas. Yeah, next please. Yeah. So one of our pristine areas is right in the center of Singapore, and it is actually these 2 nature reserves, Central Catchment Nature Reserve and Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. And what we do is we want to conserve the core areas, because the core areas are the ones with the richest biodiversity. But as we said, we need to actually give the residents this very, very important immersive experience. And therefore, instead of letting everybody run right through the nature reserves, we then provide all these nature parks around it. There's different biodiversity, not as rich, but would be able to withstand more human pressure or human visitation. And therefore, we have Windsor Nature Park, Thomson, Springleaf, Tinhua, Chestnut, Dairy Farm, Bukit, and then Hindhead. And this was just opened, I think it must be about 2 weeks ago. Yeah, Rifle Range Nature Park. Fantastic. If you all get a chance to come to Singapore, it's not just for shopping. I can assure you, we won't tell you too much about it. We're not going to put it in our, tourist brochures, because people just flood these areas. So we're just going to keep it rather quiet. And so there's special information, insider information for you. But we have lots of nature parks that you can actually visit, and it's actually quite amazing. Yeah, next please. So that's the central part. And in the northwest part of Singapore, we have the Sungai Buloh Nature Park Network. And Sungai Buloh, SBWR, Sungai Buloh Wetlands Reserve, is a part that has been conserved because of the it's a migratory pathway for the Australia-Asia pathway and flyway. And we conserve the Mandai mangrove and mudflat because we did studies and found that Mandai is extremely important for migratory birds too, because Sungai Buloh and Mandai, we have different tidal patterns. So when you have low tide in one, then it will be feeding spots for the migratory birds. And then when it's high tide, then they can move to the other areas. So that is why you have, roosting and feeding sites. So they complement each other. And again, an indication of Singapore's commitment to conservation is that we started off with Sungai Buloh, but we then, I think National Parks Board, the agency that we work for, not just myself, but Cheryl Cole and Anusha were with us for a short time. So we actually worked very hard on trying to convince the government through scientific data that the importance of these areas are crucial for biodiversity, which is actually beneficial to human well-being. And Singaporeans love food. So when you talk about food, then you tell them about, there's this special food in Singapore like laksa or chao kway teow, and you need cockles, and therefore you need to conserve your mudflats. So I think that's the other way of convincing people that, so it's cultural. So for each culture, you then have to figure out what is the best way to convince people to do conservation. Next week. And Singapore is a small, we have so little space, and yet we truly believe in conservation in that sense. So this island, the Sisters Islands Marine Park, is actually very, very tiny. But for some reason, when things are small, it's almost like a miniature world. And therefore, everything actually conglomerates or, would actually then end up. And this island here, you can find in this little lagoon here, you can find seahorses, you can find hard corals, you can find all the various kinds of marine organisms. It's quite amazing. I remember once when I think it was Jacques Cousteau's son who came to Singapore, and we thought, gosh, humble us, we will just show him this little bit of the island. He's so jaded, he's been all around the world, diving everywhere, but we showed him, I think he was pleasantly surprised by the kind of biodiversity that we could find in this little lagoon. And so it's, again, it shows that you won't know what you have until you actually survey it. Next, please. So I've shown you actually the diversity of natural capital that we have in Singapore, both terrestrial as well as marine. So now we need to intensify nature in our parks and gardens because we have quite a lot of parks and gardens. So to show you what it's like, this is before this river here used to be just a concrete canal, and it has only one function, that's to actually bring floodwaters away from the residential area. Then that is why we need to actually have an interdisciplinary, interagency cooperation. and the Public Utilities Board and NParks decided that we need to work together. We then naturalize the drain, renaturalize it. And now what we have is this system here. Before the rain, you would have the the stream running, but after a rain, this acts as a floodplain. And the great thing about this naturalized riverine coastal park is that now we have otters, we have various freshwater organisms, fish, shrimps, dragonflies, a whole host of freshwater biodiversity, all surviving now in this natural ecosystem. During flood time, it controls the flood. During drought time, if you have a drain, a concrete drain, it will be completely dry. Everything wouldn't survive at all. But if you have this naturalized river, you still have biodiversity. And people, at one time, people couldn't get to the drain at all because it had a sharp drop. And it has no recreational facilities potential at all. Now it has, people can actually use this for recreation. There are lots of schools around it, so it can be an open classroom for education, for research. So a whole host of so many functions and amenities as a result of just naturalizing and intensifying nature in our parks and gardens. Here, next. So this is the Singapore Botanic Gardens, and looking at old scripts and all, we knew that there was actually drainage around here. So what we did was actually created this wetlands within the Singapore Botanic Gardens. And it's great because it is like a floodplain. And when it rains very heavily now in Singapore, this acts as a kind of a water retention pool. Yeah. Next, please. And as I showed you in the earlier picture, the Jurong area used to have a lot of freshwater swamps, but they were actually cut down to convert for industrialization. But the Jurong Lake Gardens has focused on actually recreating this and restoring freshwater swamp. So now, and again, immersive experience. So instead of having this freshwater swamp and unreachable to people, what we have done is create this boardwalk, have an immersive, a real experience of what it's like walking through a freshwater swamp. Next, please. Here. So species recovery is important for us, and that is why we have actually carried out species recovery programs for both plants and animals. Now, the straw-headed bulbul, according to the IUCN Red Data List, is threatened in every other part of the world globally. Singapore is probably one of those few places where straw-headed bulbul is thriving quite well. And it's not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of geographical spread. So they seem to thrive quite well in Singapore. I think partly because there is no poaching. It's a wonderful songbird. Yeah. And the seahorses, and too, we managed to, breed it. Yeah. Next piece. Yeah. Now, restoring nature into urban landscape. This is a hotel. This is Park Royal at Pickering. So again, even the architects in Singapore are very in tune with, how do we actually incorporate nature into urban landscape. So this company called Woha, this Wong Man Sam and Richard Hassel, both of them have come up with wonderful urban designs in their architectural works. So that's a hotel. We have a hospital called Kutik Puat Hospital, where the CEO of the hospital said that every bed in that hospital must face greenery. And his hypothesis was that people actually recover better when they have when they see greenery, when they have exposure to nature. And it's true. I was teasing him. I said, if you know, people feel so well, they love it so much, they're not going to leave the hospital at all. They just spend more time. They know the minute they are well, we get rid of them, you know. So that's Kutek Wat Hospital. Next piece, yeah. So this is what we call housing development board building, a residential area. It's a bit like your council flats here. So this is actually what the equivalent is, government subsidized housing. And this building is Kampong Admiralty, is actually built for more the senior citizens, older population. And right at the rooftop, you community gardens. So you have rooftop gardening. People actually can plant fruits and vegetables. But more important, when I visited them, and I was actually quite surprised that in this building, even though it's actually for more the elderly, but what happened is that you have actually play school in that building. And also you have clinics for children. And I went and asked them, said, why would you have that? And they said that this is to actually encourage this intergenerational interaction, so that the parents who are, you know, middle-aged, bring their kids, send them to play school, and the grandparents pick them up, making use of grandparents, okay, free labor, but anyway, but it encourages this intergeneration interaction. And this is all, and so it's more than just biodiversity, but also this interaction, the social resilience, I think is quite important. Yeah, next please. So just to quickly show you that it's not always expensive projects and you need to do. This is the before picture. Next please. When NParks took over, they just planted some plants. Not very much, doesn't need a lot of money, or you know, you just need to plant the right plants and put in a few communities, and it completely transformed that whole environment, and people now can use that, and we will come out and have lunch and spend time sitting out rather than just, you know, see a turf area. Next please, yeah. And this again used to be just a dump. Next please. And what we did was actually convert it to connectivity so that people can use it in the walkway. The garden is actually much nicer now, the park, and it also houses rare bee species and butterfly species. So in these little pockets in between buildings, it acts as human connectivity as well as connectivity and habitats for wildlife in the city. Next please. So that's another building that shows you. This is a high-tech Fusionopolis building, and it's supposed to be for media, very old, you know, high-tech kind of thing. But all around it, you would find plants, so that it makes it all very green. Next, please. We not only have greenery, but in buildings, but for us, we felt it was very important that we connected the two nature reserves that were actually then segregated by 6-lane motorway. So what we did was work with the Land Transport Authority and then created a bridge over the highway, 8-lane highway. It was a challenge because the Building and Control Authority did not have guidelines on the weight and height and everything else. So we then had to work with them on specifying what was considered as safety guidelines for building this high so-called rich ecological corridor over an 8-lane highway. So that shows you the results of this ecological connection over a time of like 5-6 years, and we managed to plant them all with all native plants that are closely related to one half of the nature reserve and the other half. And we know that it's very well used because we have set up camera traps on both sides before and after. So we can see actually pangolins crossing, deer crossing, and birds flying through. So it is working as a good, ecological connection here next week. So we strengthen connectivity between our green spaces by various methods. One, our roadside planting. Instead of having neat boulevard-like roads, you have single species, all the same height, very manicured, very structured. Instead, we now have routes planted with native plants, and they attract butterflies, birds, bees, lizards. So there are a whole host of wildlife that actually can thrive on our roadsides, and it facilitates it. So we are targeting that every road should actually be a nature way, and we are looking at having 300 kilometers of nature way by 2030. We're getting there. Then the other one is a park connector network. And
We have
power cut, is it? Or
we lost the
reduction of-
internet here, but I'm just trying to. At least you'll have the sound. We can't share the screen at the moment because it's on the other computer. You can hear. Carry on.
Okay. So can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So that shows you again how the different layers of trees. But again, what is actually quite the first time I showed this slide, I didn't realize it because all I did was ask my colleague, can you give me a slide where it shows the multi-layered planting? And this was a slide they gave me. And then I realized when I gave the presentation that there is also another level of connectivity. And you see plants in the buildings. So that's another way of actually connecting. You have plants connect, and then it leads on over to the other side. So there's connectivity. If you plant plants within buildings, they act as another, a layer of connectivity. Yeah. And this shows you from the top what it's like where, our streetscape planting. And this multi-layered planting also has several advantages, like it would increase canopy cover, it would increase foliage, which means that you would have more carbon sequestration, and it would reduce the impact of rain. It would, which then would result in less erosion. And in terms of successional planning, when you have all these like old plants, when they die off, when they're about 50, 60 years old, they die off. Without this multi-tiered planting, you would then have a bare, roadside. So with multi-layered planting, these would naturally grow and actually take up and become, the top canopy. Yeah, next please. So we all need to actually, and we leverage on digitalization, science and technology and industry for our work. So we do a lot of biodiversity surveys because you can't, if you don't know what you have, how are you going to conserve it? That's one. And how can you make use of your biodiversity to help you, and know more about your biodiversity and what implications there are, and how can you make better use of the biodiversity. Next piece, yeah. So we have a range of uses of biodiversity for digitalization and science. For example, in our parks planning and development design, we have GIS. So that helps us multi-layering of various factors and then overlay them and then use it for our planning. We use it for animal management, for industry, for our nature conservation. So multiple uses. Excuse me. Next please, yeah. And we also use it for remote tree management because we have like few million trees. How do you monitor them? So we actually use various kinds of methods. One of the latest ones that we've used is this sensor that you put on trees such that it will actually measure the tilt of trees. And when you know that the tree, and this sensor actually would go direct to the officer in charge. So that if it tilts beyond a certain angle, it would alert the officer to say, hey, you better go and look at that plant because it could fall quite soon. So instead of having very intensive human, monitoring all the time, you make use of technology. So that's some of the uses. We've got this tree registry, which is very important. You can actually access it under www.tree.sg, I think, if I'm not mistaken here. Next please, yeah. So for, again, I think I might not have very much time. Maybe I should actually go more quickly. So these are the technology that we've used, modeling, Asian-based modeling, so that we know where are the sources and where are the sinks, so that we know which is the best place to actually conserve. Next week. So, as I said, it's extremely important that everyone plays a role. So, in planting 1 million trees, it's impossible for us to do it all by ourselves. So we have a very strong community involvement. So industry would come in, companies would say, okay, we'll donate so many trees and we'll plant it for a special occasion. Families will come and join, schools would join, community clubs. So a whole host of diversity of people are involved with this 1 million trees movement, and they're all led by the community. Next, please, yeah. So when we say everyone has a role to play, it's right from design. So if you have a park, we have a Friends of the Park program for over 50 parks. And what we do is, if we then decide we're going to set up a new park, so we have people that live around that area, ask them to suggest, can you come and tell us what you would like in your park? Because each park would have different age group and different profile. Come up with a design, concept development. Even though we would have contractors, of course, to do the construction, they would actually help out in some of it. Yeah, very important. We need to actually maintain. So landscaping, nursery work, gardening, you would have Friends of the Park joining in, and in programming and education. So every aspect of a park, right from its birth to its maintaining work and programming work, we want to involve the community so that they become part of it. That ownership is actually very important. So we have different kinds of community stewardship, nurturing this biophilic community. So right from schools and citizens, they take part in all sorts of watches, right from garden bird watch, butterfly, heron, intertidal, anything, as long as somebody would come up and lead, we'd be happy to actually encourage it. We want to encourage families too. Yeah, thanks. So we start from the very young, and this is actually a biophilic garden in the hot park that we have, and we see kids learning about ecology, streams running through, and then recycling of water. Yeah, next please. So we strongly believe in incorporating science into decision making and implementation. So NParks is one unique organization where, because we are responsible for operating, operations work, therefore we know what are the problems. So we identify the problems, and the NParks officers are encouraged to actually think of translating or identify the problem and putting it into a problem statement. And then we work with academics or amongst ourselves to find out how do we come up with a research project that will help us answer this problem, solve the problem. And once we've got the data from that research, we then formulate policy and strategy. And from there, we can then implement it, because we are part of the operations, or whether it's a park development or roadside planting or biodiversity conservation. So we implement it, then we evaluate and monitor, and then go through that iterative process. Does it work? We monitor it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, let's tweak it. So this is how we incorporate science into decision making and implementation. Yeah, next please. And the monitoring tool that Singapore or NParks have contributed the global scale is this Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity. So it's developed in cooperation with the Secretary of the CBD and the Global Partnership on Local and Subnational Action for Biodiversity. It's a self-assessment tool because we want city officials to be responsible so that they can themselves evaluate and monitor urban biodiversity conservation efforts. But we feel that universities have an important role to play here because every city has at least one university and they would have a biology department or geography department or environmental department that will help government officials, city councils or municipalities to actually collect that data. And we came up with 28 indicators, and these indicators addresses these issues. What native biodiversity do you have in your city? So there are 9 indicators. And what ecosystem services do they provide? The 5 indicators. And if you have good biodiversity and they provide good ecosystem services, what are you doing in the city level, at a city level, in terms of governance and management? So these are the 14 indicators. So if you want to look at it, please feel free. You can actually just Google for this handbook on the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity. You can actually download PDF copy. Yeah. Yes, please. So in this handbook, we said that it's a self-assessment tool. So we need to actually share with the users. First of all, the rationale for selection of the indicator. Second, how do you calculate it? Next, where to get the information, and the scoring. We insisted on actually having quantitative score because we felt that the traffic light score is not very objective. So that's why we emphasize on this quantitative score. Next, please. So the uniqueness of the Singapore Index and its diverse applications are independent reviewers have actually stated that it's the most comprehensive urban biodiversity index. It has quantitative scores, while many of the indices have traffic light score. For it to be a self-assessment tool, it must be easy to apply, but at the same time be scientifically credible and objective and fair. I remember the first time when we tried to give indicators, select indicators, we worked on the basis, how many species do you have in your city? And then charted over the years. And many of the cities felt that it was not fair because tropical cities have higher biodiversity than temperate countries. So they felt that it's not fair. So that is why you should look at it and see how we actually now make this indicator more objective, the indicators more objective and fair, right across the different geographical zones. We encourage nature-based solutions, and this is published as a handbook to facilitate the application of the SI. Next, please. Yeah. It's aspirational, meaning that we want cities to actually do it. Don't be afraid if you have a low score at first, because you can only get better, we hope. And the other thing is that we feel that cities actually should aspire to get better and better. And it encourages a network of diverse stakeholders, because to get that information, you need to actually get many, many people involved. And there are various kinds of applications you can apply it in terms of master planning of cities, because the first indicator is percentage of natural areas in a city. So if you're coming up with new cities, and there are many new cities around in the world, and therefore new cities can then say, what is a good score for how should I actually plan for in terms of natural areas within the city? And so, these are the ways that you can make use of the Singapore Index. Yeah. And then resource allocation, because you can then decide, we are not doing so well for a native biodiversity in our city. We should put more money to it. Or is it the ecosystem services? Or is it the governance? So that's the way, yeah. So this is where the different cities are. But even though we only have on this list 39, because these are the 39 cities that have actually responded or reported to us. But when we looked at the internet and checked for cities that have applied the index, there are quite a lot more that have not actually reported to us. There are about 100 over cities that we found. In Japan, there are about 70 over cities and various places. Next, please, yeah. So these initiatives will help us upscale the models of success of biodiversity conservation in cities. So from Singapore, we are now expanding it to the global context. And the Convention of Biological Diversity will be meeting in between 7th of December and 19th of December this year in Montreal. One of the decisions that we have to make is actually to expand or to extend the plan of action on subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities for biodiversity, which means that we want to empower cities that when we are looking for targets like the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which is what COP15 will discuss, just like the COP27 was discussing, some key issues. For CBD, it will be the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Embedded in it is the role that cities will play. So we are now arguing that cities can play a much greater role in meeting the targets, and using the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity as a means of actually tracking and inspiring cities to be more, biodiverse. And ICLEI has a program called Cities with Nature, which also applies the Singapore Index for the cities. The ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, they work with the ASEAN region. The Global Platform on Sustainable Cities is actually run by the World Bank. So they too are working using the Singapore Index as a way of measuring their success. And the World Economic Forum on a Global Commission on Biodiversity by 2030 also works towards getting cities to be more biodiverse. And these are all the other different networks that work on biodiversity in cities all around the world. Next, please. So we want to mainstream biodiversity, incorporate biodiversity into decision making, infuse biodiversity into not just short-term, but long-term planning processes. And we want to ensure stewardship of our natural capital. I think that's important because we need it. And integrate green and blue spaces within our urban landscape. So it's quite interesting. For those of you who intend to actually follow COP15, the Global Biodiversity Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework has all these different targets. And they all have what we call it bracketed text, which means that every target they set, there are like 1,001 different wording of the text. The only text that's target 12 that has no brackets, which means that it will go to COP15 as it is this part about integrate green and blue spaces within our urban landscape in highly dense area. So that is one part where everybody agrees. Other than that, we're going to have a hard, long journey on this post-2030 global biodiversity. So we want to enhance climate resilience through nature. So my final message would be, I think this is the right time to actually seize this unique opportunity to ensure that cities become the drivers of growth and well-being, at the same time achieving climate resilience, ecological and social resilience. We need to create cities in nature together. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for a few questions. Apologies online, we lost the internet, so we had to switch to a laptop. So it's doing the slides in real time. I'll open to questions on the floor. Anybody got a question? So Ian?
Thank you. Wow, it's a gorgeous place to live, Singapore. I couldn't spot in the index to read it very easily, but I just wondered, do the words abundance and appear in the index?
Abundance, no. Culture, it's difficult to say what culture. We tried. Well, okay, I'll tell you, it might be a long story. How selection of how many indicators, and we had to limit the number of indicators in the sense that if there are very few, then it's not robust enough. If you have too many, then you find that it becomes so unwieldy that, you know, people will have great problems. So we wanted to decide. So we had to limit ourselves to 28. So how do we decide? So we said we are going to concentrate on biodiversity, and the cultural bit, we had sort of left it to other indices to deal with it. We had to grapple with it. It was actually not easy, but we had to leave it down. Yeah. Abundance is tricky because it's actually quite laborious to go and look at, you know, to measure abundance. We actually in Singapore, we have actually a rate data book, and that depends on abundance. And for a city, it's a nightmare because I've been trying to convince my colleagues to say, can we measure quantitatively? Can we all, because we've been doing biodiversity surveys, it's not easy with limited human resources. It's quite tricky. You could use sampling, but you know, it's tricky. So we left out things that we thought would be difficult. Yeah. I hope that.
I was just wondering, so in the context of cities, obviously, like there must be a certain size of animal beyond which you just can't have them in cities. Like you wouldn't have elephants roaming around Singapore; they're just not the case in size. So,
exactly,
is there a kind of critical size beyond which, you know, cities and urban areas and animals just don't get along? So, like, say you mentioned pangolins and deer. Are deer at the kind of maximal size you get?
Yeah. Okay. We used to have tigers once upon a time. Some people even thought of reintroducing tigers. We thought, well, you know, you know, so it's not easy. Now, so I think it's not easy trying to think of correct size. We never had elephants in Singapore. Yeah. So thank goodness we didn't have to think of reintroducing elephants. Yeah. So, but we have other animals like wild boar. And when you have wild boar, again, you either depend on natural predator to actually control, and natural predator would be tigers, but there are no tigers. Therefore, wild boar would actually increase in actually numbers. So we then use, as you say, modeling to try and see population census, try and figure out what is a sustainable population. And we then have to say, really no choice. We're still grappling with what is the best way. And we might have to resort to actually culling. And it's a legitimate management control. So those are the kinds of things. But as you said, in Singapore, we have to then always look at what is the scientific way of measuring and, you know, arguing for it. So yes, hornbill was at one time a success story, quite successful. It disappeared from Singapore for a long time. And then about 100 years ago, and then about maybe 15 years ago, a pair flew across from Peninsular Malaysia, the southern bit, and then it looked around, and then we looked at it and we said, nice to see hornbills around. So we started making nest boxes. So we started nest boxes because there were not enough of big trees. So the next thing would be smart nest boxes, which means that we put cameras and weighing machines so that we could actually measure the fledglings. Yeah. And it was great because then with the cameras, people can actually see what happened in that nest box. That's a natural thing because you know what it's like, right? The hornbills, they make a hole, and then the female would actually be cooped up in that hole, and the husband, very good social study too, they're monogamous and they're very dedicated to their wives. So they would feed the female hornbill, and then we could see it such that you could see the whole development, the birth and everything. So we had these nest boxes for a number of years, but the numbers have actually grown. So now we stopped putting nest boxes and just let it grow at its natural rate. Yeah. So yes, I'm not saying that there isn't. There's also monkeys, macaques. So there is. But we've got to then educate people. So besides the a scientific kind of it's basically human wildlife interaction, and there's a great range spectrum of it. How do we deal with it? So it has got to come to some kind of a balance, with various kinds of animals. Yeah.
It sounds like overall the government of Singapore has been quite supportive of these efforts. But what were the major points of resistance or for you to persuade, and how did you overcome them? There must have been some people that were resistant to the overall strategy.
Well, because we are so small, you have limited land and sea space. They're bound to be, how should I put it? There's conflicts in land use. And you also have to then worry about, okay, infrastructure, we need space, buildings, housing, we need space. So we've got to come up with this delicate balance, that's one. And in limited space, the best way would be, how can you have multiple use of the same space? And we're constantly thinking of ways, like, for example, roadside planting. You plant more trees, more intensely packed, more densely packed. Therefore, you actually would have all those multiple benefits of trees within that same stretch. So with land use, we're thinking, can you actually, like for your drainage, you then have also park connectors above that of your, your drainage system. So those are the ways that we're thinking of. So resistance would be, as you say, how do we actually make nature incorporate the consideration of the benefits of ecosystem services, which have no monetary value, and incorporate it into your economic system. And I think we can gain a lot of inspiration from the Das Gupta review. I think that's a good one. And also for the Monetary Authority of Singapore now reviewing more regulatory system, like for example, carbon emissions, carbon trading, how do banks make loans? So we are now incorporating biodiversity consideration into more aspects so that we rethink, is it something that we have not thought about in our decision making? I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but what we're trying to do is incorporating biodiversity, the value of biodiversity, sometimes not necessarily monetary, monitoring, but we have to take in consideration that into our decision making.
Okay, I'll take one more
Yeah.
question then.
Yeah, so following up on that one, in creating new parks, has there ever been a need to sort of remove or demolish existing residential housing?
No,
And
never. We don't actually demolish housing to actually create a park. Yeah. No. Hope that-
Okay, great. Well, I'm keen that I'm sure some of you want to have a more informal chat with Lena, so maybe Lena can hang around for about 10 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
afterwards. Unfortunately, there's no drinks reception tonight, but if anybody wants to have a little chat with Lena, feel free to do so. So thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating, both to hear the fascinating story of Singapore, what's been done there, but also this potential for Singapore actually teaching much of the world about how to go about this process.
Well, we hope to be learning too, not
Yes,
just
yes.
teaching. So I think the two-way thing is actually very important. So yeah,
Yeah.
maybe another talk,
Great. Thank you.
another cities. Yeah. Thing.
Thank you. Thanks very
Yeah,
much.
thank you very much. And if you are interested in Singapore, there's just two colleagues of mine that we can actually speak to. Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you, everyone online.
Yeah, thanks.